My grandmother's deathbed confession revealed a secret baby she abandoned at a firehouse, and the truth destroyed our family. My grandmother was the sweetest woman in the entire world. She spent her weekends baking fresh bread and volunteering at the local animal shelter. She was the absolute pillar of our family. Whenever someone needed advice or a place to stay, her door was always open. Nobody ever had a single bad thing to say about her. That is exactly why her deathbed confession completely shattered my reality. We were all gathered at the local hospital in early November. The doctors told us her heart was failing rapidly and she only had a few hours left. My family decided we should all get a few minutes alone with her to say our final goodbyes. My parents went first, followed by my older brother. Finally, it was my turn. I walked into the sterile white room and pulled a plastic chair up to her bedside. She looked incredibly frail. I took her hand and expected her to give me some generic life advice about being kind and working hard. Instead, her grip tightened with a shocking amount of strength. She pulled me close until I could feel her uneven breath on my face. She told me she needed to confess something terrible before she faced judgment. She looked me dead in the eyes and told me she had a secret baby when she was 16 years old. She hid the pregnancy from her strict parents by wearing oversized coats and claiming she gained weight. On a freezing rainy night in October of 1964, she gave birth in a motel bathtub completely alone. She wrapped the newborn girl in a custom white blanket heavily embroidered with little yellow ducks. Then she walked 3 miles in the dark and left the baby on the concrete steps of a local firehouse. She rang the heavy brass bell and ran into the night. She never looked back. She made me promise to find the child. She said she chose to tell only me because I was the smartest person in the family, and she knew I would actually follow through without causing unnecessary emotional drama. Before I could even ask her for more details, the heart monitor flatlined. The nurses rushed into the room and my grandmother was gone. I kept my mouth entirely shut during the funeral. I stood in the front row of the cemetery wearing a black suit and watched my family cry over a woman they thought was a flawless saint. I felt physically sick carrying this massive secret. My dad gave a beautiful eulogy about how his mother never kept a single secret and lived a life of pure honesty. I almost threw up right there on the grass. I knew my grandmother trusted me for a specific reason. If I told my dad, his entire identity would crumble. I needed to find concrete proof and locate this missing aunt before I destroyed my family with a ghost story. The very next morning, I started my investigation. I mapped out every single fire station that was operational in our county during the 1960s. There were 14 stations in total. I spent the next 3 weeks dedicating every minute of my free time to visiting these stations. I had to ask for permission to dig through basement storage lockers and dusty archive cabinets. I sat on plastic crates for hours flipping through pages that were literally crumbling in my hands. The ink was faded to a pale brown. I read about house fires and car accidents. I read the names of men who were probably dead now. But I found nothing about a baby. I hit dead end after dead end trying to find a single needle in a 60-year-old haystack. I was starting to lose hope by the time I reached the 12th location on my list. It was a tiny decommissioned brick station now being used as a storage facility for the city public works department. I bribed a sympathetic city clerk with a box of donuts to let me look through the filing cabinets in the back office. After 4 hours of reading through mundane reports, I finally found it. The log was dated October 14, 1964. The handwriting was messy but clearly legible. A firefighter noted that the front bell rang at exactly 3 in the morning. When they opened the door, they found an unidentified female infant wrapped in a white blanket with yellow ducks. The child was transferred to the county orphanage the next morning. I immediately drove to the county records building to track the orphanage transfer, but I hit a massive brick wall. The orphanage had been shut down in the late 1970s, and all the adoption records from that era were permanently sealed by the state. I could not legally access the name of the family who adopted the baby. I realized paper trails were not going to work anymore. I needed to rely on modern science. I ordered premium DNA testing kits from the 3 largest ancestry databases on the market. I swabbed my cheek and mailed them out the same day. The waiting period for the DNA results was easily the worst part of this entire ordeal. I was living a complete double life. During the day, I was analyzing data spreadsheets at my corporate job and pretending to care about quarterly metrics. At night, I was falling down dark internet rabbit holes researching adoption laws from the 1960s and reading terrifying stories about the county orphanage system. The psychological toll of holding a secret that could nuke my parents' marriage and my dad's sanity was incredibly heavy. I started losing sleep. I was surviving on black coffee and sheer stubborn willpower. On a random Tuesday afternoon, I received an email notification on my phone. One of the databases had finished processing my sample. I logged into the portal with shaking hands. The screen loaded and showed a massive red alert indicating a highly significant genetic match. The system identified a user as a potential half-aunt with a 25% DNA overlap. The user had an active profile under the name Victoria Harding. I stared at the name for 10 straight minutes. I clicked on her profile, but there was no picture. There was only a brief bio saying she was looking for biological relatives and lived right here in our exact city. She had been living incredibly close to us this entire time. I carefully drafted a private message through the portal. I did not want to scare her away. I introduced myself and explained that my grandmother recently passed away. I told her about the deathbed confession and specifically mentioned the white blanket with the yellow ducks. I hit send and waited. Victoria responded less than 20 minutes later. Her message was incredibly brief and devoid of any emotion. She confirmed she still had the blanket. She gave me an address for a local upscale coffee shop and told me to meet her there at noon the following day. She explicitly told me to come alone. I barely slept that night. I had no idea what to expect. I pictured a sad, lonely woman who just wanted a family connection. I could not have been more wrong. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and grabbed a booth in the back corner. At exactly noon, the front bell chimed. A woman walked through the door and my blood ran completely cold. She looked exactly like an older version of me. She had the exact same bone structure and the same dark eyes. But the physical resemblance was not what terrified me. I knew exactly who she was. It was not Victoria Harding. That was clearly an alias used for the website. The woman walking toward my booth was Valerie Vance. Valerie was the senior partner at the massive wealth management firm that handled my entire family's estate. She had been my dad's trusted financial advisor for over 15 years. She attended our summer barbecues. She sent me a gift card when I graduated college. She was deeply integrated into the background of our lives. Valerie slid into the booth across from me. She did not smile. She just stared at me with an incredibly cold and calculated expression. I was completely speechless. I stammered and asked her what she was doing here. I asked her if she was Victoria. Valerie calmly reached into her designer leather tote bag and pulled out a faded piece of fabric. She placed it on the wooden table. It was a small white blanket heavily embroidered with little yellow ducks. The fabric was old and worn but completely undeniable. My brain could not process the information. My grandmother abandoned her baby. That baby grew up to become Valerie. And Valerie intentionally worked her way into our family business. I asked her how long she knew. Valerie let out a sharp, humorless laugh. She told me she knew the truth for over 2 decades. She hired a very expensive private investigator when she was 30 years old to track down her biological mother. The investigator eventually traced the hospital records back to my grandmother. Valerie discovered that the woman who threw her away like garbage went on to live a perfect, wealthy suburban life with a brand new perfect family. Valerie explained that her adopted family was incredibly abusive. She grew up in deep poverty while my dad grew up with private schools and luxury cars. She felt a level of pure hatred that I could not even comprehend. Instead of confronting my grandmother and causing a brief emotional scene, Valerie decided to play a much longer and much more devastating game. She went to college and became a brilliant financial strategist. She intentionally targeted my dad's business accounts. She spent years networking in his exact circles until he naturally hired her firm to manage his growing wealth. She became his most trusted advisor. She literally held the keys to everything my family owned. I felt a wave of pure panic hit my chest. I asked her what she had done. Valerie smiled. It was the most terrifying smile I have ever seen in my life. She leaned across the table and lowered her voice. She explained that for the past 15 years she had been slowly and legally transferring my family's assets into incredibly complex offshore shell companies. She used legal loopholes and ironclad investment contracts that my dad happily signed without reading because he trusted her implicitly. She did not just steal money. She legally bound my dad's business to toxic debt and leveraged his properties against massive hidden loans. She told me my grandmother dying was the final piece of the puzzle. When the estate passed down to my dad last week, it triggered a massive automated liquidation clause Valerie had secretly buried in the portfolio years ago. I was sitting across from a monster. I pulled out my phone and told her I was calling the police. Valerie did not even flinch. She took a sip of her black coffee and told me to go ahead. She explicitly stated that every single transfer was technically legal and authorized by my dad's own signature. She told me the police would spend 5 years trying to untangle the offshore accounts, and by the time they figured it out, the money would be completely untraceable. She had engineered the absolute perfect financial ruin of the family that abandoned her. I asked her why she even agreed to meet me if her plan was already complete. She looked at me with cold, dead eyes. She said she originally planned to just disappear next week and let my dad figure out he was completely bankrupt on his own. But when I sent that message on the DNA site, she could not resist the opportunity to gloat. She wanted at least one person in the bloodline to know exactly why their perfect life was suddenly destroyed. She wanted me to know that my sweet, flawless grandmother was the sole reason we were about to lose everything. Valerie stood up from the booth. She carefully folded the duck blanket and put it back into her expensive bag. She looked down at me and told me I should probably start looking for a cheaper apartment because my trust fund was officially empty. She turned around and walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. I sat in that booth for 2 straight hours, completely paralyzed. My grandmother's deathbed confession was supposed to bring closure. Instead, it unleashed an absolute nightmare. My family was about to be financially decimated, and my dad was going to lose the company he spent his entire life building. I finally forced myself to stand up and walk to my car. I knew Valerie thought she had won. She thought I was just a naive 25-year-old kid who would cry and accept defeat. But she heavily underestimated me. My grandmother was right about one thing. I am the smartest person in this family. When I pulled up to the corporate litigation firm, the sky had turned a dark, bruising purple. The wind was howling off the harbor. I sat in my car looking up at the massive glass skyscraper. Valerie built a fortress of stolen money and legal paperwork. She used our own trust against us. She weaponized my father's good nature. But arrogance is a massive vulnerability. She could not resist the urge to look me in the eye and brag. She gave me a head start. She confirmed the timeline and she confirmed her exact methods. That was her one fatal mistake. I grabbed my laptop bag and stepped out into the freezing wind. I was about to spend every single dollar I had left to hire the most aggressive forensic accountants on the eastern seaboard. Valerie wanted to destroy my family to avenge the past. I am going to destroy her to protect the future. Subscribe for more daily videos.